Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So what if being a mankind idiot? One nation controlled by the media. Information age of hysteria. It's going out to idiot America.
Most of us first heard of the alt-right on August 25th when Hillary Clinton name-checked it on the campaign trail in Reno, Nevada.
And the latest shakeup was designed to, quote, let Trump be Trump. So to do that, he hired Stephen Bannon, the head of a right-wing website called Breitbart.com, as the campaign CEO. Now, to give you a flavor of his work, here are a few headlines they've published. And I'm not making this up. Birth control makes women unattractive and crazy. Would you rather your child had feminism or cancer? Gabby Giffords, the gun control movement's human shield. Hoisted high and proud, the Confederate flag proclaims a glorious heritage. And that one came shortly after the Charleston massacre, when Democrats and Republicans alike were doing everything they could to heal racial divides that Breitbart and Bannon tried to inflame. Just imagine Donald Trump reading that and thinking, this is what I need more of in my campaign. Now, Bannon has nasty things to say about pretty much everyone. This spring, he railed against Speaker Paul Ryan for, quote, rubbing his social justice Catholicism in my nose every second. No wonder he's gone to work for Trump, the only presidential candidate ever to get into a public feud with the Pope. It's truly hard to believe, but according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate groups, Breitbart embraces ideas on the extremist fringe of the conservative right. This is not conservatism as we have known it. This is not republicanism as we have known it. These are racist ideas, race-baiting ideas, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-women, all key tenets making up the emerging racist ideology known as the alt-right. Now, alt-right is short for alternative right. The Wall Street Journal describes it as a loose but organized movement, mostly online, that rejects mainstream conservatism, promotes nationalism, and views immigration and multiculturalism as threats to white identity. So the de facto merger between Breitbart and the Trump campaign represents a landmark achievement for this group, a fringe element that has effectively taken over the Republican Party.
So far, the members of the alt-right movement have lived mainly in narrow corners of the internet, spreading hate and seeking fellow travelers. Richard Spencer, who's considered the founder of the modern alt-right movement, describes his members this way in a video released by his white nationalist think tank, the National Policy Institute.
Who are we? We aren't just white. White is a checkbox on the census form. We are part of the peoples, history, spirit, and civilization of Europe. This legacy stands before us as a gift and as a challenge. For what our ancestors took for granted, we must discover, we must renew.
Until recently, such rhetoric was the province of people previously known as the lunatic fringe. But with so many of those cohorts lined up in support of Donald Trump and rebranded with the anodyne catch-all alt-right, the extremists have leaked into the mainstream. They even have a popular news and commentary site, Breitbart.com, flying their banner. With a sense of political legitimacy within their grasp, last week they held a Washington press conference and unveiled a new logo, which looks strikingly like two Klansmen in hoods. Mark Potok, senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate groups, explains what is at the core of the alt-right.
Fundamentally, it's about race. Its basic idea is that white people in white people's countries, quote unquote, like the United States and most of Europe, are under assault by the forces of political correctness, of social justice, and so on. The whole movement really begins in Europe as a kind of anti-Muslim movement 10 or so years ago.
But surely the roots of this in the United States are more than 10 or 15 years old. You've identified significant overlaps between what now calls itself the alt-right and what we long knew as white supremacists and various other hate groups.
That's right. I mean, it's essentially a rebranding of white nationalism or white supremacy for the digital age. It is a band of white supremacists who are trying to give themselves a better look, much as David Duke did in the late 1970s. When he said, it's time for us Klansmen to get out of the hoods and robes and into three-piece suits. It's time to get out of the cow pastures where the crosses are burning and into the hotel meeting rooms. In other words, we need to present ourselves in a way that reasonably rational Americans might actually find something attractive about us. David Duke was an out-and-out Klansman, a neo-Nazi who used to like to wear swastika armbands and that sort of thing. And by nominally disavowing the Klan and nominally separating himself from some of his old friends, David Duke in 1991 was able to come fairly close to becoming the governor of Louisiana. So in his case, he was able, at least for a short time, to successfully rebrand. And I think that is very much the hope of Jared Taylor, of Richard Spencer, and of other leaders of the alternative right. They've not been looking at any kind of electoral success in literally decades. They are hoping that with the help and the dog whistling of Donald Trump, that will change.
Well, they've certainly found their way into the political conversation, and they seem to have grown out of their virtual headquarters on 4chan and other very narrow corners of the internet. They not only were identified by Hillary Clinton, which did them no harm, they essentially have an official mainstream backing publication in Breitbart, the popular right-wing website. Tell me about the connections between Breitbart and the core of the alt-right movement.
Well, about 18 months ago, Breitbart began to really focus in on the themes that are nearest and dearest to the core of the alt-right movement. Immigration, in particular non-white immigration, the alleged threat of a Muslim takeover. Not so long ago at all, just a few months ago, actually published a major defense of the alternative right, in which, among other things, it talked about people like alt-right leader Jared Taylor, a guy who has described black people as incapable of sustaining civilization of any kind, as allegedly racist. In other words, Breitbart's position has been to say that these people are accused of being racists, but of course insinuates that that's not so at all. So Breitbart has essentially moved into the camp of the alt-right and become a major platform. That's why Steve Bannon's move to the Donald Trump campaign has been so eyebrow-raising.
Yes, he was the chairman of Breitbart News. He is now in charge of the Trump campaign. I want to ask you about the continuum of deplorability. Can the average blue-collar white guy in a Rust Belt state be lumped in with a fire-breathing militiaman in northern Idaho?
No, I don't think it's fair to lump in the average Trump supporter with David Duke or some neo-Nazi up in the Pacific Northwest at all. I think the reality is that people out there have been fed a steady diet of falsehoods and misinformation. You know, if you are not a sophisticated consumer of the news, but you are being told by your congresspeople, by other politicians, by certain pastors, for instance, that Muslims have a secret plan to impose Sharia law on the United States, or you're being told that gay people are engaging in a massive conspiracy to seduce your children. And on top of all of that, you're having trouble finding a job because you've been in the timber industry or working in a steel mill for most of your career. These things may seem to make sense. You may look at a Donald Trump and see a man who's, quote unquote, not afraid to tell it like it is. The sad thing is that all of these claims are utterly false. And yet, as I say, there are politicians, there are pundits, talk radio stations that pour this kind of poison into the kind of river of American democracy constantly. And it makes it extremely difficult for people to see the world as it really is.
Let me ask you one last thing, Mark. Over the decades, I've been following the output of the Southern Poverty Law Center and being alternately disgusted and heartened. Disgusted because these hate groups are so repulsive. Heartened because if you added them all up, the neo-Nazis, the Klansmen, the militias, it was such a small number of those involved in organized hate movements. Has the alt-right changed that math?
I'm not sure that the alt-right has changed the math, but it describes something that is happening or was happening with or without the name, which is the kind of broadening and mainstreaming of some of these very ugly feelings. On the other hand, it's got to be said that all the polling shows, for instance, that the youngest cohorts of people in this country have absolutely no problem with racial intermarriage or interracial relationships. And I think that we are headed ultimately to a better place. You know, when we finally come to that place where whites are no longer a majority, we will, in a sense, have finally realized the promise of becoming a multicultural country in which no one single group dominates. So I think we're going through a rough patch, but I do think that at the other end, we should have great hopes of creating a better, more just, and more fair society.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mark Potok is Senior Fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. If you are unaware of an alt-right movement, don't be embarrassed. Most Americans don't spend hours a day haunting online message boards like subreddits or 4chan, dens of subversive humor and just plain subversion where good old-fashioned haters of various kinds find common cause. They may be nasty, but they reside in the shadows. So imagine their mirth at suddenly being treated like a legitimate movement by the outside world. They call us the normies, and especially our fascination with their unlikely meme, a cartoon by the name of Pepe the Frog.
I've just learned it today. Pepe the Frog is apparently some icon you put in your pictures that show solidarity with the alt-right.
Right, with white supremacy.
After the basket of deplorables comment was when you really started to see some of these alt-right memes go mainstream.
Miles Klee is an editor for the Daily Dot.
You know, Trump's son shared one of them that included Pepe. It's the Photoshop of the movie The Expendables, except it's Trump and all his surrogates. And on one wing, you see that Pepe actually outranks Rudy Giuliani. You know, somehow he's more useful.
Klee is a Pepe fan from way back, well before the frog was embraced by white supremacists.
Pepe is relatively ancient in terms of internet lore. He first existed in 2005 on MySpace and then made his official debut in a comic called Boys Club, where he's one among a couple of like teenage monster type people who hang around eating pizza, playing video games, just generally chilling out. He was not ideological in the least, except for being pro-friendship and good times. His big moment in the comic that kind of turned him into a meme later on involved one of his friends walking in on him in the bathroom, and he's taken his pants all the way down to pee. And Pepe says, "Feels good, man." So that's kind of his ethos. It's just sort of do what feels good, do what comes naturally, and have a good time with your friends.
So he's like the dude in The Big Lebowski, except that he's a cartoon frog.
Yeah, you could say that. There's a sort of zen to him for sure.
Okay. But now he has been embraced, one might even say co-opted, by the alt-right. How did that happen?
So when Pepe first became a meme, it was on 4chan. It's a message board that's been around for a long time, and it sort of represents the worst of the best and the best of the worst that you can find on the internet, and really revels a lot of times in kind of political incorrectness. So Pepe fit basically any mold that people wanted him to. That included some very feel-good, kind of wholesome stuff, but it also started to include racist, anti-Semitic, misogynist people have been making 9/11 jokes with Pepe for years. And so what you see in Pepe's use by the alt-right is kind of an outgrowth of some of his more offensive incarnations.
So he was kind of the O negative, the universal donor
Yeah.
of memedom. But now the blood supply is tainted by these hateful right-wingers, which is kind of hard to explain, although Hillary Clinton's website tried to,
Right.
with the sentence, "That cartoon frog is more sinister than you might realize," which
Yeah.
just sounds hilarious and ridiculous, and yet I guess is true.
I think what's funny there is, taking it that seriously really just feeds back into the joke of meme culture, which is, why would anyone be taking this seriously in the first place? Pepe can be an avatar for a lot of things, but to suggest that he's kind of symbolic of neo-Nazi party in America or that kind of ideology is just really hilarious on its face, because he's just kind of a versatile icon that can be deployed in any possible way. When Hillary says that Pepe the Frog is dangerous or sinister, the trolls love that. I mean, you can go find a bunch of threads right now on 4chan or Reddit of people laughing themselves silly over the fact that they have forced Hillary to kind of reckon with a cartoon frog at all, when it's kind of distracting from the real issue there, right?
Right. So I can see why it, from a certain perspective, is hilarious, and it's a very subversive little joke. But let me just point out, rainbows once were just rainbows, and now they're heavily associated with LGBT culture. Not that it's a bad thing, it's just that it is. The six-pointed star makes nobody think of a sheriff badge, and the cross, which once upon a time was just a cross, for crying out loud, is the global symbol of Christianity. So I'm not sure that now that Pepe is associated with the alt-right, that it can ever go back to being just the O-negative meme of convenience for whatever you want to kind of goof around with. Can it?
What it feels like to me is that, he's one of these memes. He doesn't really obey a lot of the rules. He kind of existed in a time before virality as we understand it. He was pre-YouTube, pre-Twitter, and he's really managed to endure. And in fact, you could say he gains in strength the more people like us try to talk about him. Earlier this year, we saw the Damn Daniel craze go completely haywire immediately. He went on Ellen. That meme was kind of declared dead as soon as daytime TV got a hold of it. But Pepe has always shown this uncanny ability to buck the narrative, and I fully expect he's going to continue to do that.
Miles, thanks a lot.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Miles Klee is an editor for the Daily Dot.